Welcome to the NKNews Podcast, recorded here in Seoul on September 27, 2018. I am your host, Jacko Zwetsloot. And today we are doing something new, something different. I'm joined in the studio by Chad O'Carroll, founder and managing director of Korea Risk Group, under which umbrella NK News and NK Pro exist. Today, Chad and I are going to give listeners a taste of the North Korea A Month in Review, a product available exclusively to NK Pro subscribers. Hi, Chad, and thanks for joining me.
Good morning, Jacko. Nice to be with you.
Thanks for coming back. Yes, and can you tell our listeners a little bit about what NK Pro is and how is it different from NK News?
Yeah, so NK News is our day-to-day news website, lots of news articles, opinion, sometimes some analysis from academics like Steph Haggard or John Everard. He's written for us in the past. NK Pro is designed more for people that work on DPRK issues. So that can be people from government, from military, intelligence. Then on the flip side, academics often use our NK Pro website, think tanks, research organizations, media, and increasingly the corporate sector as well, sanctions compliance, things like that. And I guess the main difference is, besides cost, the main difference is that NK Pro features a number of research tools and media monitoring services, which are really just designed for people that work in this sector to save time and connect the dots of information that's out there that they may not have necessarily realized can be connected.
Okay, and can you tell us about North Korea A Month in Review?
Yeah, so we launched this last month. We're now in the second month of this. And the idea of it is really just to provide a synopsis of everything that's happened in the past 30 days or so, from everything from foreign relations to human rights to nuclear. And in each section, we're trying to also explain why these developments are significant. So, for example, on the nuclear sector, we'll have like a why is this important for the business community and also for government. And in these sections, we try and tease out parts of the recent developments that can be useful for those from those communities to understand. And you might not think that there's necessarily a link between nuclear issues and what the business community can do in South Korea, but sometimes there is, and we really try and make that as clear as possible. And at the end of it, we also include a look ahead at the 5 things that we think will be most important in the next month, which is quite tough.
Now, this month's report is 29 pages long, and after the executive summary, there's 8 sections. There's one on inter-Korean relations, one on leadership. There's 2 sections on foreign relations, one that focuses specifically on US DPRK and another one that focuses on broader sanctions and implications. And then there's a section on weapons of mass destruction, one on the economy, and the second last one on human security, and the last one, as you mentioned, on the month ahead, what to expect. So today we've decided to talk a bit more about inter-Korean relations, the economy, human security, a bumpy ride for US DPRK relations, and the month ahead. Let's see how much we can get through.
All right.
We've set a big goal for ourselves. Okay, so inter-Korean relations. We've, of course, just had the third inter-Korean summit with a promise of a 4th before the year is out. We talked a bit about this last week in our Rough and Ready round table. Is there anything to add that we didn't talk about? Anything more big picture in terms of summitry?
Well, I think for me, the big takeaway from this inter-Korean summit was that a lot of people before Moon went up to Pyongyang were anxious that things were not going to go well, that it would be tough to get results on this summit. But he's actually done quite a good job in balancing interests of the US with this inter-Korean diplomacy. And the outcome has really, in a way, saved the day as far as what was really quite turbulent US DPRK relations through August, especially after that 4th Pompeo trip was cancelled. So Moon, again, has played a very catalytic role in reinvigorating relations between Pyongyang and Washington. He did this before, after the second summit in Panmunjom that was hastily organized in May, when, again, things were going bad and it looked like Trump was going to cancel the Singapore summit. So, Yeah, I think that was the big takeaway from this recent Inter-Korean summit. And the question is, how long can Moon keep playing this role? We saw going into this summit that his popularity ratings had been dropping to new lows.
Right, here in South Korea.
Yes, here in South Korea. And he's managed to flick them up by 10, 15% as a result of that summit. But these things are always short-lived. And we know in South Korea that there's demand for people for Moon to focus more on economic issues and recession. And so will he always have the latitude to sort of jump into the inter-Korean diplomacy to reboot things as and when is needed?
Yeah, I suppose there's a little bit of a risk of President Moon becoming a bit like Gorbachev back in the latter days of the Soviet Union, where he was doing great on the international stage, but back home he really didn't handle the domestic issues so well. And we're seeing that President Moon's popularity is being affected in South Korea because of these domestic issues, so that the high jobless rate and the sluggish growth and things. And it's these when he strides the world stage that it gets a bit of an uptick again.
Yeah, I definitely think that could be a risk. And of course, he's also, we shouldn't forget, in this past month, two of the things that occurred were the opening of this Inter-Korean liaison office and the failed attempt from South Korea to do this trial run on the Gyeonggi line up to Sinuiju in North Korea, which was blocked by UN Commander Vincent Brooks.
Yes, I wanted to talk about both of those. In fact, let's talk about the liaison office. That's been open. Well, tomorrow will be 2 weeks since it's opened. And I understand there are some issues with oil supplied by the South.
Yes, so South Korea didn't get any sanctions exemptions to open this liaison office. And the argument for not getting them is a little bit awkward. I've heard some South Korean officials state that, well, look, up in Pyongyang, you have the Swedes, the Germans, Bulgarians. They've all got embassies and no one's screaming sanctions violations when they bring in supplies and, hardware for their daily operations. Fair enough. The issue, though, is could you really describe an inter-Korean liaison office as having a diplomatic status when you have two countries in the same office and the supplies are being used not just by South Korea but by North Korea too? And then you get this whole fishy argument about the Korean constitution, which states that North Korea is just part of South Korea anyway. So how, therefore, would you have a diplomatic status in Kaesong when it's actually just South Korean national territory anyway, as far as the constitution is concerned? Is
that argument actually being used by the South Korean government?
No, that part isn't. But the part about the diplomatic status... Right. What has been used. The one thing that is notable, though, is that Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa, she said one day before the Foreign Ministry said it didn't need a sanctions exemption, that in some kind of hearing in Seoul, that US officials had told her that they weren't satisfied with this line of explanation. So, yeah, it suggests that there's some friction with the US. And the oil thing that you mentioned, the data that we saw from the Korea Customs Service in June and July showed that the South Koreans had shipped 82,918 kilograms of oil, ostensibly for, I believe, power generation.
Yeah, I don't know how to measure that. How long can that last if you're running?
Well, I don't know if this is a like-for-like comparison. It probably isn't. But yesterday I was looking into something separate, and a Boeing 737 takes about 25,000 litres of jet fuel, and that will fly for 6-7 hours. So that's, we're looking at, if it was like-for-like, we're looking at maybe 3 times that, which seems like a lot of energy to just keep the lights on. In an office.
Well, yeah, although we don't know how long that's like, is that a monthly thing or is that supposed to be for 3 months or half a year?
That's true.
We don't really know. And there's the other thing to bear in mind is that jet fuel and generator fuel are different kinds of fuels that burn at different rates or something. Again, I'm totally not an expert in this. Now, to go back to the friction that you just mentioned, has anybody from the United States government or USFK, or even the representation to the United Nations, publicly said anything against the liaison office? Possibly.
I didn't come across it in my research for this. The only thing I did see was this remark by Foreign Minister Kang about the fact that explanations on sanctions were not satisfactory. I mean, we've heard things on the grapevine, certainly from sources, that there is, especially in August when things were not going well between the US and North Korea, that officials in Washington were not happy with the fact that South Korea is plowing ahead, not getting sanctions exemptions. It doesn't exactly portray a clean image as far as this effort to maintain maximum pressure and so on.
No, but despite the rumblings, it does look like they're trying to deal with it on a government-to-government level behind the scenes rather than openly criticize or call for.
So far, yeah. And now that the US DPRK thing's rebooted a bit, I think it will be overlooked for the short term.
Now on to railway cooperation. Now, if a railway connection could be worked out between North and South Korea, and goods could be shipped from Seoul through North Korea to Russia, China, and onwards to Europe and even Great Britain, what would that mean for freight transportation? I imagine it would shave a lot of cost and time off of shipping stuff from South Korea to the rest of the world, right?
Yeah, of course. If you were able to ship by rail from South Korea all the way up through North Korea onto China, you can access Russia, you can access Europe. It's a lot cheaper by shipping by cargo train. In terms of time, it's a lot quicker. These ships can take weeks to get to Europe. So it would be a big game changer for sure. And just one example of a sector that we've been discussing where there would be an interesting impact relates to energy. I was talking to a client organization recently, and they told me that if this rail line got connected, it would reduce South Korean demand for gas products, which are shipped in from countries like Australia, by about 30% a year, because there would be South Korea would be able to import lots by train from Russia. So it would have some interesting impacts on the economy here for sure if it was produced.
Yeah, and geopolitically it would change Korea's status from effectively being an island to actually being part of the Eurasian mainland again for the first time since 1945.
Yep, which would have lots of welcome effects as far as food prices and things are concerned. Things like fruit are so expensive in South Korea. And I think part of it is just due to that lack of land connection.
Now, there was supposed to be some kind of a test run of a train. I don't know if it's on the eastern coast or the west coast, but because there's a track on both sides of the Korean Peninsula. There was supposed to be a test run, but I understand that there were some bumps in the tracks. What happened?
There was, yes. It was meant to be a train that South Korea was going to send up on a sort of, was it 7 or 8 day journey up to Sinuiju and back. And it was going to be bringing all sorts of testing equipment, fuel supplies, and basically the UN command, which is responsible for the military demarcation line, DMZ, all of that stuff, rejected South Korea's paperwork to send the train up, citing some technical issues. And the question is this really a technical issue, or is it like a political problem that is being excused as a technical issue? And we don't know. And it's that latter explanation would kind of fit with what we know to have been some of the grievances on the US side in the last month or so.
Well, I spoke to a diplomatic source recently who's close to these kinds of matters, who said to me repeatedly that it was simply that the South Korean government did not send the paperwork within 48 hours. Everything that goes through the demilitarized zone or the joint security area has to be okayed by the United Nations command, and that requires a 48-hour interval before the actual, going through. And that the South Koreans were playing a bit fast and loose with the time, tried to submit the paperwork within the 48 hours, So after that window had closed, and the UNC said, no, that's too late.
So a South Korean source told me that they understood the problem was that Brooks wanted detailed itinerary information of what the train would be doing once it crosses the border. But then that raises the question, why is that really the UN Command's business? Because they're not responsible for the train once it goes into North Korea. So I don't know. It's one of those things that will probably need archives to come out in future to really know what happened. But it wasn't a good look for this lockstep alliance that we always hear about.
That's right. So all in all, in terms of North-South relations, what's the big takeaway here? What's the significance of it all the last month?
Just that they play the relationship between North and South really is actually going to be a vital aspect of the denuclearization process going forward. And you may remember that in 2017, the North Koreans rejected talking to South Korea. They didn't want to talk to Moon at all.
That's right. Moon made lots of overtures, but Chairman Kim seemed to be very firm in, you do you and we'll do us.
And lots of insistence on this being a US DPRK problem by Pyongyang that should be negotiated bilaterally. But I think Kim Jong-un has realized now that actually Moon is able to play a really supporting role in this process. And so I think moving forward that this is something that should be welcomed as a support to this diplomacy. But at the same time, there is some risk in the sense that, Moon has his own issues to contend with and may not always be able to jump in to save the day when things get bad between Washington and Pyongyang.
All right, let's turn to the economy now. Kim Jong-un managed to find time between 70th anniversary celebrations, a summit meeting, and other diplomatic meetings to do some of his regular on-the-spot guidance, just as his father and grandfather did. And you write in the review that there's been a rural focus recently. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so Kim Jong-un did 3 appearance visits at the start of the period that we looked into for this month in review, which was August 18 through 21, I think. There were 3 separate appearances, and they were all in different rural parts of the country. And all of them would have required a fair bit of travel time for Kim Jong-un. And we thought that was interesting because it goes against the grain of this common line you hear amongst a lot of North Korea watchers that there's this Pyongyang mirage and everything else is really developing throughout the country. And North Korea has actually very little interest in developing areas outside of the capital. But here he was, on one of his busiest months, featuring, I think it was nearly over 20 diplomatic meetings. Yeah. He still found time ahead of all of these September 9th festivities to do these 3 inspection visits. So I think it's a good reminder that there is stuff going on outside Pyongyang, and the leadership recently has been quite embracing of going to see those sites.
Now, is this simply yet another sign that the 2-track sort of parallel Pyongyang line policy of nuclear weapons and economic development, that they're now focusing on the latter rail?
There's been a lot of economy stuff recently. Last month, when we did this initial month in review thing on the leadership section, Kim Jong-un had done a record number of appearances.
One with his shirt off, as I recall.
Yep. And overwhelming focus on sites of economic importance. So, it's definitely, the propaganda is all reflecting this line these days. Kim Jong-un's appearances are reflecting this line. There is always the possibility that all the nuclear stuff is still going on behind the scenes as usual. Yeah. We shouldn't forget that Kim Jong-un said in his January 1 speech that the nation's ballistic missile and nuclear scientists should start mass producing ICBMs. But on the surface, at least, they're definitely supporting the line issued in April at that plenum meeting that the economy should now be the main focus. And there are some other interesting indicators that back up policy preference. We just had the 2 trade fairs. We had one in Rason in August.
Yeah,
one in Pyongyang. And the Rason one, we counted, my colleague Hamish McDonald counted 114 companies at the Rason one, and the Pyongyang one, according to official North Korean reporting, which we haven't been able to verify yet, there were 320 companies, which when you look at the counts of all the previous ones since 2007, this would be the highest ever number of companies at the Pyongyang Trade Fair.
Were these all North Korean companies, or were there foreign companies there as well?
So at the Rason one, it was a mixture. I think 52 were North Korean firms, the rest foreign. So slightly more foreign ones. And at the Pyongyang one, we haven't been able to go through our photos of it yet on a booth-by-booth basis, which is what we always do on NK Pro and if there's a trade fair. But we do know that from the state media reporting and from some work by our colleagues over at Associated Press that there were companies from New Zealand, Australia, Russia, China.
Goodness.
So a few foreign companies there, lots of Chinese ones, and lots probably of ignorance of sanctions.
Well, I was going to mention it. Is this a strange thing, two trade fairs within a month of each other, for a country under so many sanctions and embargoes, and for there to be foreign companies present? What does that all mean?
Yeah, I think on the Chinese side, it may be two things. One is just people don't care about the sanctions.
Yeah, I think China's definitely a exceptional situation.
I mean, the UN since January has prohibited all joint venture operations in North Korea. I don't think there's been a single penalty for anybody in breach of that. And the Chinese, there are just dozens of these joint ventures openly marketing their work in the trade fairs. But then another part of it, I think, is ignorance. And this may be a good point to mention that when Moon went to Pyongyang, he brought these 17 business leaders from the likes of Samsung, Hyundai. And one of the side effects of that we think is that, when small companies that don't read news about North Korea every day, when they see that 17 of the biggest South Korean firms are in Pyongyang, they probably think, it must be business is back to normal. No, the sanctions have been lifted. And there's probably a very deep level of ignorance. And that can be an interesting side effect of these high profile delegations, is that people just think, game on again. We can work in North Korea, no problem.
Yeah, tell us more about the visit by the big chaebol heads that went north with President Moon for the summit. Which companies do we know were represented, and what did they get up to while they were there? So
Samsung, LG, Hyundai, we know CJ Group was there. Ostensibly, the idea was to just to consider the potential of inter-Korean economic projects. We don't really know what happened in the meetings that they had. And there was recognition from the South Korean side. Presidential spokesman Yoon Young-chan said that they're aware there's a certain limitation on economic cooperation because of sanctions. But these all occurred within the framework of Seoul's new economic map initiative, which was announced last year. And there were about 17 who went, and we also know that there was a little bit of controversy surrounding their arrival because the government here in Seoul had to come out and state that the delegations hadn't been invited under pressure from North Korea to bring these chaebol buses, that they'd come independently. There's one thing that the South Koreans didn't say there, which is a little bit different in this case. So if, say, former President Park Geun-hye was going on one of her many trips to Washington, D.C., lots of Korean businesses would be vying to get in that plane to go with her. Right. And it would be a kind of competitive process in a way, because there's lots of economic business opportunity that can come from going with their president. That obviously doesn't exist in North Korea at the moment. And we understand that in this case, the Blue House, I think, selectively proactively invited them, rather than it be the other way around, where the invite requests are coming from the chaebol themselves.
Now, how's the North Korean won doing against the US dollar these days? Is it up, down, or stable?
So this is an interesting area, because through 2017 and much of this year, even when pressure was really, really high, the North Korean won was very, very stable against the US dollar. Now, as many of our listeners know, there are two exchange rates in North Korea. There's the official one, which runs about 121 to the dollar, and there's the unofficial one, which runs about 8,000 to the dollar. But actually, one of our NK Pro contributors, Benjamin Silberstein, noticed in August that the rates had gone up to about, according to the Daily NK, to 8,280 from 8,000. And then one of our sources gave us a data point of 8,400 on August 19th. I mean, it's still relatively modest.
Yes, it's a less than 10% drop, isn't it, in value?
Yeah, but it's strange because it's just been so stable for the past year and a half. It's just strange that it's happened all of
Yes, I suppose given all the sanctions that were imposed, to see a change now is odd, isn't it?
Yeah, and it also comes after a much bigger rise on euro and dollar exchange rates, which occurred in wintertime through early spring this year. The price went up by about 10-15%, I seem to remember. So I don't know. But one thing we do know is that during our trip to Pyongyang recently, it was really vividly clear that people didn't want to take euros. There was just a lot of demand for dollars. In a taxi, a couple of times we tried to pay in euros and they said, no, give us dollars. In the hotel, they insisted on us paying in dollars in the Yanggakdo.
Insisted?
Yeah. Well,
so it almost suggests that they're afraid of not being able to get rid of their euros.
Yeah, it's odd. And then we were told if we really want to use euros, you're going to get a 1-to-1 rate with the dollar. So you're going to lose. Goodness. You're going to lose on that big time. So our guide even said, I highly recommend you change these. And so we did. But yeah, there's
which is a big change, because when I was there in 2010 and also last year, it was always euros that was preferable.
Yeah.
Very few places would actively ask for dollars.
Yeah, and 3 diplomats on the ground in Pyongyang, 2 of them told me that they'd really noticed this as well in recent weeks. But one of them said to me it had been like that the whole year he'd been there. So it's hard to know. So
what's the big takeaway, big picture from the North Korean economy?
That it seems to be doing pretty well given the circumstances, that the economic focus seems pretty real, and it's leading to development in the countryside, etc. And from the chaebol bosses, the conglomerate bosses who've gone there, it does seem to be sending the message from South Korea that Seoul stands ready to embrace massive economic cooperation with the North if and when circumstances allow.
None of them have as yet announced any plans, I imagine.
No, but many of them do have the North Korea research teams that they've spooled up since this sort of early spring when diplomacy started picking up.
Right. All right, let's move on to human security. And you've chosen 3 subtopics here. One of them prisoners, the other one family, and the third one being floods.
Yes.
So prisoners, foreign citizens imprisoned in North Korea. Who has Pyongyang set free recently?
So 39-year-old Japanese national Tomoyuki Sugimoto. He was released on August 26th, and he was on a tour through North Korea and was arrested. News of his arrest came out around August 10. So he was released within 2 weeks. And during that process, we suspected that he would actually be facing much longer jail time than has actually emerged. So some of the...
Do we know what his ostensible crime was?
So I've spoke to several sources familiar with this, and one of them said that the issue was he was acting rather suspiciously throughout the tour. I've got photos of him. Every photo I've seen during that tour, he wears sunglasses, an all-black outfit, and this like bonnet hat. He was not taking part in any group photos during the entire trip, which was several weeks long. He had 2 or 3 cameras on him at all times, including this kind of one on a joystick, a GoPro around his neck. He'd been there multiple times, and I understand always looking a bit out of sorts from the rest of the travelers. And apparently in Nampo, near the end of the tour, he took photos of a military checkpoint And as you know, in North Korea, that's a big no-no. And that served as the trigger for his arrest. But it does come on this sort of canvas of kind of unusual behavior throughout the last several weeks of the tour. And it's interesting because obviously Japan DPRK relations are not great, and they were really in pretty bad ways throughout August, and so that the Japanese government was able to secure his release after just 2 weeks is quite remarkable.
That is surprising. That would have been, I imagine, through some kind of intermediary, perhaps the Swedes or somebody like that.
Well, we understand the Japanese Foreign Ministry was going to the North Korean embassy in Beijing on a regular basis during that time to try and sort it out, and they did.
So maybe as a result of all this, or perhaps this is a catalyst, yesterday we saw Shinzo Abe in New York at the United Nations General Assembly saying that he's willing to normalize relations with North Korea, willing to sit down with Kim Jong-un. So perhaps we're seeing a thaw in North Korea-Japan relations now.
You wouldn't know that looking at North Korean state media, though. I have an alert set up for the word Japan on our KCNA Watch website, and every time there are stories about Japan, they get emailed to me, and I've just been getting dozens of them, and all of them extremely negative. Again, we know that North Korean media is not always the best reflection of what's actually going on in the government level there.
True. Now, who is still held there in North Korea, so far as we know, in terms of foreign citizens?
So this Japanese case really hammered home the fact that we've now had 3 inter-Korean summits, and yet there are still 6 South Korean nationals in jail in North Korea, and these are not 6 who are all arrested at once. They're several separate cases. I think maybe 3 or 4 cases. And what's remarkable is that we've had the return of 3 Korean American citizens prior to the Singapore summit to the US. We've had the Japanese Sugimoto released after 2 weeks. And yet, despite all this really warm relationship between Seoul and Pyongyang, Moon has had no luck in bringing these people home. And he did bring it up at one of the summits, but apparently no joy there. And the other odd thing is that these 6 South Koreans, most of them have been linked by North Korean media to the National Intelligence Service, the South Korean spy service.
I see.
And yet Seo-hoon, who is the chief of the NIS spy service, he's been one of the regular participants in this shuttle diplomacy to the North, met Kim Jong-un several times, and yet still no progress on this is quite... And no one talks about it in South Korea. Families are not speaking. You never see it in the media here. When you look at how media responded in America to Otto Warmbier and even the less controversial cases, there was always campaigns to bring these people back, and it just, in South Korea, you wouldn't know that anyone was arrested. And I think a lot of the general public probably aren't aware of that either.
Now, on to family reunions. Almost 200 North Koreans and a similar number of South Koreans were able to see their long-separated family members at the Kumgang Mountain Resort. These reunions have been on again, off again for almost 2 decades now. In 2008, South Korea paid for and built a 12-story center that was set to function as a permanent venue for reunions, but was never used. So after the 3rd Kim Moon summit, where are we now with these reunions?
We have heard that the South Koreans would invest in rehabilitating the Family Reunion Center in Kumgang. They've announced 33.6 billion won to support,
which is about 30-something million US dollars.
This is a 12-story building in Mount Kumgang that was built in 2008. It was never really finished.
Because that woman was tragically shot.
Yes.
A South Korean woman on the tour was shot, and that was the end of all the tours to Kumgang-san.
Yeah. So this is if it goes ahead, then this can be a place to facilitate sort of highly regularized family reunions. And there was also commitment from both sides to start doing online video messages and things like that to be exchanged between the two sides. Just again, though, will South Korea apply for sanctions exemptions to do this? There's a very good argument that it should, because this sounds like it's going to be a quite major construction project, and it will involve a lot of metals and hardware that is likely to fall under some of the HS codes that are currently sanctioned. So yeah, we'll have to see, but there'll be probably some small business opportunities for firms in South Korea to take part in this.
Now, flooding in North Korea. North Korea is prone to summer floods, partly because of poor agricultural and reforestation planning over the decades. What happened this year?
This year we had a really significant heat wave in August, temperatures up to 40, but then in contrast, really massive rains. We had the typhoon Solik that came. Didn't really do too much in South Korea, but really torrential rains in the north. And according to UN OCHA, Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, some 86 North Koreans died and 65,000 had been displaced. The North Korean media never actually released any figures on the precise impact, but it's quite significant. So there was also some really bad damage from the flooding for the highway, Pyongyang Kaesong Highway. We did some satellite imagery analysis of that. There's been Red Cross have earmarked some $213,000 to help with the rehabilitation process, but that is quite a small amount. You know, part of the focus is also on human rights, not just human security in this monthly roundup, but really very few developments in the human rights sector in the past month that were of note. And it may just be a lot of the NGOs were sort of winding down for the summer, August season. But certainly it should be said that the governments in Washington and in Seoul are not exactly promoting this subject at full force these days.
Right, they do seem to take a back seat when there's negotiations underway, don't they?
Right. So it's likely to mean that in the months ahead that at least at a government level, there are not going to be any major new initiatives. South Korea hasn't had a human rights ambassador now for 9 months, maybe. Ambassador Lee was the last one. And of course, the US has dropped its special envoy for human rights issues as well for several months now. Biegun, the new special envoy, is not
Stephen Biegun, yes.
He's not going to be likely to take that portfolio up, I would imagine. So,
what is his role?
Special envoy for North Korea. So that's basically leading negotiations. It will mean that Pompeo shouldn't be the one that goes to Pyongyang for all this shuttle diplomacy as Secretary of State. There'll actually be a dedicated North Korea lead for that.
I want to return to Pompeo in just a second, but so just wrapping up the human security and human rights issues, what's the wider significance of it?
In terms of wider significance, I think just, again, this fact that there are these 6 South Koreans still in prison in the north, there's something strange going on there. It does, to me at least, suggests that the North Korean allegations that they have NIS connections could be true. This may be why they're not being released. They were arrested under the Park Geun-hye administration when relations were really, really bad. So it's possible they're linked to NIS forces from that era, which the North was probably very unhappy with. The other thing that sort of comes from that is about the fact that the North Koreans, while the South Koreans are not pressing the North on this issue of the 6 prisoners, the North Koreans have also not been pressing the South on the family restaurant workers.
The restaurant workers,
since July. So that.
Well, there was a story that a couple of them have now got passports, was there not?
Yes.
How was that, a week or two ago?
There was, I think it was 2 weeks ago. There was an update which said that they'd all been issued passports.
All of them?
But then there was still question mark as to whether or not they can travel to overseas countries, whether they'd need permission or.
So we'll have to keep an eye on that in the coming weeks and months to see whether they actually travel or whether they choose to remain in South Korea. Just a sort of a final thing. We don't have a lot of time to focus fully on it, but US DPRK relations. You just mentioned the new special envoy from the US to the DPRK, Stephen Biegun, and that in theory he would be taking over some of the burden of dealing with North Korea from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. But Mike Pompeo is planning to take a trip, the one that was cancelled last month. What's going on there?
Yeah, so he's stated since this Inter-Korean summit that he's looking to go again soon, and I think most likely that trip will serve two purposes. One, to introduce Biegun to the North Koreans officially.
So they'll be going together?
I would imagine so. Biegun was meant to go on the last one that was cancelled. The second thing is, I strongly suspect that trip will be laying groundwork for a second Trump-Kim summit. And there has been talk of that even taking place as early as October. One rumour one of my colleagues heard about yesterday was that it could even take place in South Korea in the
a three-way summit or
DMZ. We really don't know much yet on that, but it does seem the US are very interested in those commitments the North Korean offered. I mean, if the North Koreans were to shut down all of Yongbyon, which contains plutonium reprocessing and uranium enrichment facilities, that is it's not the end of the nuclear program. There are still other sites,
right?
But from an arms control perspective, it would slow down DPRK capability of producing more fissile materials. And if you want to be realistic, that's definitely something that should be welcomed in the short term, and it seems the US want to try and do that. But again, the problem is, will there be enough flexibility on the Washington end to offer concessions that will be attractive to North Korea?
So it looks like an interesting period in US DPRK relations is about to begin. Apologies to the special envoy there. So finally, what do you expect from the month ahead?
Well, the UNGA, that's already started to take place. Lots of speeches there.
Yes, Ri Yong-ho's there, isn't he?
Yeah.
Is that his second trip? I know he was there last year saying many strongly worded statements.
Yeah.
It's a happier feeling now, I suppose. Has he spoken yet, or is that still to come?
I believe it's still to come. We've had Trump, obviously. He did a bit of fire and fury on Iran this year.
Yes, Iran is the target of his ire, but North Korea, only kind words for Kim Jong-un.
Yeah. Then we've got the resumption of US DPRK talks, as we just said, Pompeo, and of course the potential planning for this next summit. One of the things we thought you might start seeing are some initial indicators surrounding North Korea's pledge to dismantle the Tongchang-ri Sohae rocket launch engine test facilities. Now, when it came to the return of the MIAs, which North Korea pledged could be done immediately after the Singapore summit, it actually took 45 days for that to realize. So if you look at the similar timeline from the pledge of the Pyongyang summit, by the end of the next month, we maybe will start seeing the seeds, like invitations to journalists, to experts to come and watch this dismantlement activity. Then we also thought there should be a case kicking off in the courts in Singapore to investigate OCN, the luxury goods company accused of selling luxury goods to North Korea, tea specialist and his boss, Leo Ng. That was scheduled to kick off September 27th, but for the second time in 2 months, the case mysteriously got dropped.
Oh, dropped, you say? Not pushed back, but dropped completely?
Well, we couldn't find it on any court schedules yesterday, so we've put a press inquiry in with the Singaporean government to ask about that, but it's been delayed once, and the status now, one would assume it's just being delayed again, but interesting that this happens, and you do wonder whether governments around the world have interest in prosecuting historic sanctions incidents when diplomatic relations are going quite well.
Anything else to add for the next month?
Just Party Foundation Day's coming up, October 10th. That'll be the 73rd anniversary. This is actually the Party Foundation 2010 was when Kim Jong-il introduced Kim Jong-un to the world. So there are sometimes big military parades, but as it's the 73rd anniversary, it's going to be a very modest affair.
Yeah, they like their 5s and 10s, don't they?
Exactly. So It is the last day of the mass games, though.
Oh, it's actually finishing.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Okay, well, thank you, Chad O'Carroll, for giving us some selected highlights from this month's excellent and information-packed North Korea A Month in Review. This feature and many more are available to NK Pro subscribers, so if you are already an NK News subscriber, consider updating to NK Pro, and if you are not yet an NK News subscriber, then consider a one-year subscription. You'll find that it really is full of valuable stories, information, and photographs fresh from the North. And we'll be back next week with another podcast. Till then, goodbye.